Into the Inklands is finally here, and it contains some very fun, very spicy cards, so I thought I would show all of you my top 5 cards in each ink for Disney Lorcana's third set, Into the Inklands. Normally I'd want to go in alphabetical order for the 6 inks, starting with Amber, but there's one card we can't ignore that I think changes the way we have to build decks and play Disney Lorcana entirely, and that's Morph Space Goo. Morph is an inkable 2-cost rare card in Emerald with 2 strength, 1 willpower, and 1 lore. It's a Storyborn ally alien, and the most important part is its ability Mimicry, which says you can play any character with shift on this character as if this character had any name. Floodborn characters being able to shift onto other characters with their name is a core and fun mechanic in Disney Lorcana. Many Floodborn characters like Beast Tragic Hero, Cogsworth Grandfather Clock, and Lady Tremaine Imperious Queen see consistent play in top tier decks despite not having characters that either efficiently shift them or are worth running in your deck, meaning you're always paying the full ink cost of the characters. Even some characters that you do have decent shift targets, like Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, opt to not play their shift target in order to create room for other needed cards. Not to mention, if you're relying on a shift target in order to get your character out early, it can be really telegraphed since you're forced to play a character with the same name. If I see an Aladdin on turn 4, I have to assume one is being shifted on turn 5. Morph solves all of these issues. Most characters that don't have an efficient shift target now do. Don't want to run a suboptimal shift target just to be able to play your character earlier and cheaper? Well, now you can play Morph. Not only does he become an efficient shift target for that one card whose shift target is suboptimal, he becomes a shift target for every Floodborn character in your deck. Rather than having to play 2 other characters just to have shift targets for your 2 Floodborns, you can play Morph and he's a target for both of them. Also, now if you play Morph, your opponent may be expecting a Floodborn character, but it could be any Floodborn character. They won't know it's coming because the shift target isn't telegraphed. Morph on his own could potentially allow Floodborn characters that saw little play before being played now for all of these reasons. Decks that want to run lots of Floodborn characters can rely on Morph to keep you on your toes by not telegraphing what their game plan is, but still creating a threat and giving you more space in your deck for other impactful cards rather than their specific shift targets. From here on out, every Floodborn character can no longer be written off for whether it has a good shift target or not, because you can always pair them up with Emerald and play Morph. For all of these reasons, Morph easily makes it in the top 5 cards in Emerald this set. Emerald got some real bombs this set, so we're going to move on to the next card, Ursula Deceiver. She's an inkable 2-cost uncommon with 1 strength, 3 willpower, and 1 lore with the ability You'll Never Even Miss It, which says when you play this character, chosen opponent reveals their hand and discards a song card of your choice. Anybody that's been playing Disney Lorcana for a brief period of time should already know both how strong songs in general are, since they can be played for free, but also how prevalent specific songs like Be Prepared, A Whole New World, and Grab Your Sword can be. They've been meta-defining cards for the past 2 sets almost to an impressive point because of just how much value they create. Ursula finally answers decks that rely too heavily on songs like these, potentially giving other decks that couldn't be played the ability to be played because those other decks will be less consistent with Ursula in the meta. This isn't the only Ursula that I think will be strong for Into the Inklands. We also have Ursula Deceiver of All, which is an inkable 3-cost, 2 strength, 3 willpower, and 1 lore character. She has the ability What a Deal, which says whenever this character sings a song, you may play that song again from your discard for free, then put it on the bottom of your deck. As if songs already weren't super strong because they can be sung for free, Ursula lets you sing them twice, then puts them back into your deck. Since Ursula costs only 3 ink, you can only do this with songs that cost 3 or less, but there are still some really good options in this range. You can sing Friends on the Other Side to draw 4 cards from your deck, Let the Storm Rage On to deal 4 damage and draw 2 cards, the Bare Necessities to discard 2 non-characters from your opponent's hand, or the Bosses on a Roll to look at the top 5 cards of your deck, pick which ones go on top and bottom in the order you want, and gain a lore twice. You can also play Bippity Boppity Boo to trigger interplay effects multiple times, Mother Knows Best to bounce multiple characters back into their player's hands, or Sudden Chill to force your opponent to discard 2 cards. You get the idea. Ursula is a value machine, and in a deck that cares about songs like an Amber Flutes deck, or a deck that just wants to abuse the value that comes from playing songs for free, she's a huge threat that I have no doubt will see play, which is why she made it on this list. Speaking of songs, Emerald got a song that I think was really needed for them specifically and will find its way into the majority of the decks that need a little help with card draw. Strike a Good Match is an inkable 2-cost song that says draw 2 cards, then choose and discard a card. This card is really simple, nothing fancy, but Emerald really struggles with card advantage and card draw because their only options before were Improvise, Prince John, Hypnotize, Donald Duck, and Mad Hatter. None of these things are particularly consistent because they either need other things to happen or are suboptimal to play. Strike a Good Match digs you further into your deck and is unconditional, so you aren't having to build further around the card just to get a little more card draw. It's as close to a card card like Friends on the Other Side I think Emerald will ever see, and because of that, I think this is going to see lots of play. And for the last of my top 5 in Emerald, we've got Kit, Cloud Kicker, Tough Guy. Kit is an inkable 3 cost with 2 strength, 2 willpower, and 1 lore. He has the ability Sky Surfing that says when you play this character, you may return chosen opposing character with 2 strength or less to their player's hand. The reason I put Kit in my top 5 was because Emerald has a lot of really good cheap characters, but oftentimes can be stopped before they really get going due to characters your opponent plays to keep you from exerting your own. With Kit Cloud Kicker, you can now play out a really strong turn 1 and 2, then bounce back other threatening characters on your opponent's board. Kit hits a ton of targets at 2 strength since he can bounce shift targets so your opponent loses a ton of tempo, not being able to curve out correctly. Basically, that just means you stop your opponent from efficiently spending their ink every turn. If you play Kit Cloud Kicker and bounce Tiny Tactician, your opponent can't play Giant Fury when they wanted to. The same thing applies when you're playing against an aggro matchup. You can bounce their cheap, low stat but high lore characters before they get to quest with them, slowing them down and helping you get the lead. I really recommend you go look at all the characters Kit can bounce because there's a lot of them that I think would really put you ahead or slow your opponent's game plan when used at the right time. Now that we've gone over the top 5 Emerald cards for the set, let's move on to Amber. None of the cards on these lists are ordered in any particular way for Amber, but Bare Necessities was an instant include in my top 5. For similar reasons to Ursula Deceiver, Bare Necessities is great. It's actually a little better because it doesn't specify song cards specifically. When you play Bare Necessities, you get to look at your opponent's hand and discard any card that isn't a character. Now, not only are you able to hit oppressive song cards like Be Prepared in a Whole New World, you can discard items, actions, and any locations that might be crucial to a deck's win condition. The fact this is only 2 costs and can be sung for free makes it even better. If you pair it with Ursula Deceiver of All, you can force your opponent to discard 2 non-character cards also. Unless you're playing against a Mufasa deck that primarily runs characters and that's it, Bare Necessities will likely net you some value. Even on the worst case scenario where you only get to look at your opponent's hand, information is everything. You can see what they're working with and plan around it accordingly. I think this card could be one of the most impactful cards in the entire set. The next card on my top 5 list for Amber is Kida, Protector of Atlantis. Kida is an inkable 5 cost character with 3 strength, 5 willpower, and 2 lore. She's Floodborn so she can shift for 3 and has the ability Maybe We Can Save Our Future, which says when Kida is played, all characters get -3 strength until the start of your turn. This ability is a really strong one because you can essentially keep all of your characters safe from being challenged for a turn. Kida's ability only applies to characters that are in play, so your opponent can play a rush character and challenge one of your own, but if you have a wide board, losing one character is better than losing all of your characters. Kida lets you exert all of your characters to quest, sing, or use their ability without the risk of repercussions. Throw in a bodyguard or 2 to make sure your more valuable characters are definitely safe, and you can take a big lead. Speaking of bodyguards, Kida has 2 shift targets, the 1 cost Goon in Amber, and also the 2 cost bodyguard in Steel. Amber Steel is already a really strong ink combination, and the Steel Kida is a great card already. This gives you a perfect shift target for turn 3 in case you wanted to sing a 5 cost song, or just play a well-statted body early. I think Kida is a great card to put in any aggro or mid-range deck to extend your character's mileage just a little bit further, which is why she's on this list. Creating wide boards is something Amber thrives at. We saw Dalmatian Puppies enter Lorcana along with 99 Puppies and a plethora of other puppy cards further embracing this strategy. Although I think there are some pretty good cards within the puppy theme, Perdita Devoted Mother was the one that made its way on my top 5. Perdita is an uninkable 6 cost with 1 strength, 6 willpower, and 2 lore. The more important thing is her ability, which is Come Along Children, which says when you play this character and whenever she quests, you may play a character with cost 2 or less from your discard for free. We've seen a few cards in Disney Lorcana so far that like to cheat cards off the top of your deck or bring cards back from your discard. Just being able to put a character back into your hand was pretty strong with Hades. Although you can't bring any character back with Perdita, she takes it even further simply playing the card for free. That's immediate value on top of Perdita herself. The fact she does this on play is phenomenal because if she gets removed before she can do anything else, you've already gotten value from her. Then it gets even better because if she does survive until next turn, she can do it again while questing. Any ability that gives you extra value while progressing your win condition is one worth paying attention to. Being limited to a character of 2 costs or less might not sound great because what could be so valuable that was so cheap? Well, Perdita can bring back shift targets for characters that can be shifted out that turn. She can bring back high lore but cheap characters to threaten more lore on board to close out the game earlier. She can bring back bodyguards to give your opponent one more thing they need to get past before dealing with your real threats. She also synergizes perfectly with Stitch Rockstar to play a 2 cost character or less for free, triggering Stitch to let you draw a card. She helps Lucky meet his condition of needing to see 4 other characters in play. Same thing with Piglet Pooh Pirate Captain. Perdita is a great card in Amber to really lean into the low to the ground wide board strategy and is definitely worth worth considering for those decks in my opinion. Continuing the theme of cheating characters out, Amber got another card that does this in a different but familiar way. Pluto Friendly Pooch is an uninkable 1-cost card with 0 strength, 2 willpower, and 1 lore. He also has an ability that lets you exert him to pay 1 less ink for the next character you play that turn. Pluto is a super fast way to start getting bigger characters out on board. He's very similar to Doc, which saw lots of play for the same reason, except Doc is slightly better because he can do this when he quests. You can use Pluto to play a 3-cost character on turn 2, or combo him with even more Amber cards that discount character costs to play big characters fast. This Pluto actually makes a pretty good shift target for the Floodborn Pluto we saw this set, because you can play Pluto on turn 1, Lanterns or another Pluto on 2, then use those in 3 ink to shift your big Pluto on turn 3, getting a 3/8 bodyguard with 2 lore and an ability that removes 3 damage from it at the start of your turn as early as turn 3. Pluto Determined Defender didn't make my top 5, but is definitely an honorary mention here. You can also just play Pluto turn 1, then play Doc or Ariel on turn 2, and these are just the options in Amber. There's so many other strong 3-cost characters available to play in the other inks as well. There's actually another 3-cost Amber character we got this set that I think would be a great play and made it into my top 5, and that's Baloo. Baloo is an uninkable 3-cost with 0 strength, 3 willpower, and 1 lore. He's a bodyguard and has the ability Let's Make Like a Tree that says when this character is banished, gain 2 lore. If Merlin Goat taught us anything, it's that characters that gain lore outside of questing, and especially when banished, can be really strong. Baloo being a bodyguard means your opponent will have to get through him if they want to get to your other characters. If they can't send him to your hand, deck, or inkwell, they'll have to banish him, which might make your other characters vulnerable, but it progresses your win condition in the process. It's a lose if you do, lose if you don't card for your opponent. If they don't banish Baloo, he can sing and quest for lore while protecting your other characters. If they do, they're helping you get closer to 20 lore. I think Baloo is a great card in a deck that's already trying to get to 20 as fast as possible, since he can protect your heavy questers while getting you even closer after he's done his job. Moving on to my top 5 Amethyst cards for Into the Inklands, it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that Jafar Striking Illusionist is in here. Amethyst thrives when it comes to drawing cards, so naturally when a card that lets you gain lore every time you draw a card is put in Amethyst, it's gonna be strong. Next to gaining lore, drawing cards is one of the most powerful things you can do in a trading card game, because the more cards you have available, the more options you have, the stronger plays you'll be able to make. You're also more likely to have the answers you need for your opponent's threats, or the cards you need to keep giving yourself the advantage. Combining lore gain with card draw is bound to be beautiful. There's the obvious combo between Jafar and A Whole New World. You can shift Jafar on turn 5, sing A Whole New World, and gain 7 lore while refilling your hand, but with cards like Bare Necessities and Ursula coming this set, I don't think this will be the most consistent strategy when playing with Jafar. Rather than building your whole deck around him, you're likely already playing a bunch of cards in Amethyst that draw cards anyway, so having Jafar as another threat in your deck on top of the other good stuff in Amethyst like Merlin, Ursula, Arthur, and Elsa forces your opponent to answer yet another major threat. There's a lot of cards that can slow down or stop Jafar's shenanigans altogether, but the threat of his ability on his own I think will require decks to play cards with him in mind, which is why he's made it into my top 5. As I just mentioned, drawing cards is good, which is why Amethyst got what's probably the strongest location in the entire set with the Queen's Castle Mirror Chamber. The Queen's Castle is an inkable 4-drop location with a move cost of 1 and 7 willpower. It's got 2 lore and the ability Using the Mirror, which says at the start of your turn for each character you have here, you may draw a card. My biggest issue with most of the locations this set is that they don't do much if you play them on curve, so they either have to do a lot when played on curve or do a lot when played later in the game. This is one of the few locations that I think you're totally fine to play on curve, even though that means you won't be able to move anything to it yet. On turn 4, when you play the Queen's Castle, your opponent immediately has a decision to make. Expend a lot of their resources to banish the Queen's Castle, leaving their characters exerted, using valuable removal cards in their hand, or leave it alone and let you gain 2 lore the next turn immediately, then potentially move a bunch of characters there to draw a bunch of cards. And there really isn't an efficient answer to this location on curve. Even the infamous Maui isn't strong enough to be played on turn 5 and banish this location on his own. This card by itself is going to make your opponent scramble or force decks to start running silver bullets like Rise of the Titans, and I expect it to see lots of play. You know what's even better than drawing cards? Gaining lore instantly. The Boss is on a Roll is a 3-cost inkable song that lets you look at the top 5 cards of your deck, put whichever ones you want on the top and bottom in whatever order you want, and gain a lore. As mentioned before, Merlin Goat and the Sorcerer's Spellbook have shown us just how strong a card can be that gives you access to instant lore. This is just another card in Amethyst that requires no setup for you to gain lore, and it's one of the best filtering cards in the game now. Being able to dig 5 cards deep and have full control on what you move to the bottom, what you keep, and what order you draw gives you lots of control over the next few turns. This is also a card that really helps any deck find the pieces they need if there are any combos the deck is built around. Since Since this is a song, it can be sung for free, creating even more value. I know you don't draw any cards, you just put them back on top of your deck, but Amethyst doesn't struggle at all when it comes to drawing cards, so I don't think it'll be difficult to get those cards in your hand if you needed or wanted to. I think this is a super strong card and just greatly increases consistency in Amethyst decks, so it'll see some play. In case Amethyst didn't have enough draw power, they also got Genie's supportive friend to grant your 3 wishes when he quests by drawing 3 cards after shuffling himself back into your deck. Genie's stats were already pretty good for a 4-cost unit, and drawing 3 cards at a time is pretty dang good. Just another card that increases Amethyst's consistency. Not much more to say though, just a well-statted character with a pretty good ability. Finally, for the last card in my top 5 in Amethyst, I chose Magicka Dispel, the Midas Touch. This is a really unique card, being able to shift on 5 with the ability All Mine that says whenever this character quests, gain lore equal to the cost of one of your items in play. I'll be honest, item synergy was not on my bingo card for Amethyst this set, but I think there's some cool synergies here to explore. Sapphire is the obvious pick when it comes to items, and they already like to play cards like Fishbone Quill and Eye of the Fates, which would make for some pretty good targets for Magicka. You could use Eye of the Fates to give Magicka an extra lore, quest with her, then gain 4 more lore since Eye of the Fates costs 4 ink. Sapphire has lots of ways to get expensive cards out for cheap, so there might even be a world where you can have Lucky Dime and Magicka on board to quest for 7 lore. I don't think Sapphire is the only viable ink for this though. Amethyst on their own have some pretty strong items with Sorcerer's Spellbook and White Rapids Pocket Watch, and so does Amber, Ruby, and Steel. Admittedly, their options are a little more slim, but I can see something forming here. One of the things I think is cool with Magicka is that she doesn't have any printed lore, so when you play her, you can play an item next turn to surprise your opponent with some unexpected lore, or do the opposite where you set up a way to shift Magicka either with items already on board or items at the ready to start gaining lore quickly. Now I'll be honest here, I'm not entirely convinced Magicka will be any good in a competitive setting, but that's why this is my top 5 list and not a most competitive list. Still, in a pool of decks that aren't all fine-tuned to be competitively viable, I think you could have some fun with Magicka and actually get her to pop off a few times. Now that we're through with Amethyst and we've already gone over Emerald, it's time to move on to Ruby. Ruby, more than any ink for Into the Inklands, got support for the big new card type introduced in this set, locations, and the cards that synergize around them don't seem too bad. Jim Hawkins makes the cut in my top 5 because of his abilities This Is It that lets you play a location with cost 4 or less for free when he's played, and Take the Helm that lets you move Jim Hawkins to a location for free when it's played. He has pretty okay stats, especially with his 2 lore, and can create a lot of value. Any card that lets you play cards for free is worth looking at, and in this case, Jim Hawkins lets you play 9 resources worth of cards for only 5, not including the ink cost required to move him to a location. Of course, this ability is only as good as the locations are, and we already saw the Queen's Castle and how strong of a card that is, but I also want to talk about the next card that made it into my top 5 for Ruby, RLS Legacy Solar Galleon. At first glance, RLS Legacy has a lot going on. It's an uninkable 4 cost with a move cost of 3 and a whopping 8 willpower with 2 lore. Looks kind of expensive. It gives characters evasive while they're at the location, but also reduces its move cost by 2 when a character is already there. With this ability, you can play Jim Hawkins on turn 5, play RLS Legacy for free, move Jim Hawkins there for free. Now he has evasive, and it only costs 1 ink to give your other characters evasive. Just like the Queen's Castle, all that willpower on RLS Legacy is going to be a real problem for your opponent because there just aren't great answers for locations that are so beefy. If your opponent can't get rid of the location quickly, then that's 2 lore you're gaining on the next turn. Of course, having to pay the initial 3 ink to move a character can be a big hurdle for this location if you don't have Jim Hawkins, but that's why the next card also made it on my top 5 list for Ruby. Voyage is an inkable 1-cost action that lets you move up to 2 characters of yours to the same location for free. The cost to move characters is one of the biggest hurdles for some of these locations. With Voyage, you're usually gaining lots of value because even if you're moving 2 characters to a location that has a move cost of 1, you're only paying 1 ink instead of 2. It's even better when the move cost to a location is more expensive and you're bypassing it completely. In my opinion, Voyage turns a lot of locations from unplayable to playable and is a key card in any deck that cares about them. It's just simple math and lots of value if you're able to use it efficiently. Of course, it wouldn't feel right if Ruby didn't get any decent removal cards with the new set. Prince Eric, Expert Helmsman, is arguably Ruby's strongest card in this set, which is why I didn't even have to think when putting him on this list. At first, his stats look really low for his cost, but after reading his ability, it all makes sense. His ability Surprise Maneuver says when this character is banished, you may banish chosen character. This makes Prince Eric a powerhouse because he's doing so many things at once. If your opponent exerts their characters, you can challenge one that will banish Eric to banish any of them that don't have ward. If you quest with Prince Eric, your opponent doesn't want you to keep gaining 2 lore a turn, so they need to banish him. If they have more than one character on board, then you get to banish something back. Worst case scenario, if you need an emergency banish button, you can play Teeth and Ambitions on your own Prince Eric to banish an opposing character. Prince Eric is so good because oftentimes he should be taking out 2 cards for every one of him. Prince Eric isn't the only removal card Ruby got in Into the Inklands, because we've also got Madame Medusa the Boss. Madame Medusa has an ability called That Terrible Woman that says when you play this character, banish chosen opposing character with 3 strength or less. This card is very similar to Lady Tremaine Imperious Queen. The most important difference is that Lady Tremaine doesn't choose which character gets banished, your opponent does, and she's Floodborn, so if you need to, you can play a Lady Tremaine and shift another Lady Tremaine on top of her to banish 2 characters. Madame Medusa lets you choose which character is banished, which is pretty big. Currently, most people are learning to play around Lady Tremaine by making sure they play a cheap or throwaway card next to their bigger, better character so they don't leave a single character on board. Although Madame Medusa won't hit every character since their strength needs to be 3 or less, you can at least choose the character you want to banish so that your opponent can't get around it by playing a cheap character. Combine this with some amber cards like the Queen or Kita, and we might have something here. 3 strength or less sounds like it might be a pretty small pool, but it actually hits quite a few really good cards. I honestly think the thing that'll dictate whether people play Lady Tremaine or Madame Medusa will be up to the current meta and which one is better to tech, but I expect to see Madame Medusa played. Now that we've gone over my top 5 Ruby cards, it's time to move to Sapphire. We're going to start off with Motunui Island Paradise, which is an inkable 2-cost location with a move cost of 1, 5 willpower, and 1 lore. It has a really interesting ability called Reincarnation that says whenever a character is banished while here, you may put that card into your inkwell face down and exerted. This card gives Sapphire a way to ramp while keeping control of the board or forcing an opponent to think twice before they want to use that grab your sword or be prepared. Sure, the opponent can banish and challenge the location before using any of their removal cards, but then they're spending part of their turn challenging with their characters instead of questing or singing, which is probably the next best thing to not doing anything. You can also use this card on the offensive if planned correctly. If your opponent is forcing you to make trades with your characters, you can play this card, move your characters that would be banished and challenges to it, and trade away. Your opponent's characters go to their discard while yours go into your inkwell, ramping you past them. Motunui is a perfect example of a location that forces your opponent to deal with it, otherwise they may pay in the long run, which is why I put it in my top 5. The next card on my top 5 list for Sapphire is How Far I'll Go, an uninkable 4-cost song that lets you look at the top 2 cards of your deck, draw 1, and put the other in your inkwell. This is basically develop your brain, except the extra card ramps into your inkwell instead of going to the bottom of your deck. One of the reasons this is such a strong card in my opinion is because of card advantage. Not only does this card replace itself when it's played, but you can almost think of it as actually drawing 2 cards since you're taking an extra card and putting it into your inkwell that you otherwise wouldn't be able to for that turn. How Far I'll Go actually nets you a card when viewed this way. Because this card is both drawing you a card and doing what Sapphire likes to do by ramping, it made its way into my top 5. Next on the list is Grammatala, Spirit of Ocean. She's a Floodborn card that can shift for 5 ink with the ability Do You Know Where You Are, which says whenever a card is put into your inkwell, gain 1 lore. This is another ability we see entering Disney Lorcana that progresses your win condition through other means than questing. Although I don't think this ability is as strong as Jafar's ability that synergizes with card draw, it's rewarding Sapphire for doing the thing it's already doing, which is ramping. So far, Sapphire ramp has been a little lackluster, I think, because of the way Lorcana works versus other games. In other trading card games, your win condition is often tied to your character's strength. Your opponent often has a life total of some kind, so the bigger the characters are you can play, the more damage you can do to your opponent, and the faster you can win. You can also use those big strength characters to control the board if needed, so they serve 2 purposes. They can progress your win condition further than cheaper, smaller cards, and they can control the board more effectively than cheaper, smaller cards. Since Disney Lorcana's win condition is questing to 20 lore, and lore is a completely separate stat to strength, ramping doesn't work like it does in other games. We take a card like Triton the Sea King and look at him, he's an expensive character with really efficient stats, so he'd be able to survive quite a while challenging and being challenged by other characters. If we also look at Lilo Making a Wish, she's the opposite of this, a very fragile, cheap body, but she quests for 2 lore. Triton undoubtedly would survive longer than Lilo would, but both cards progress your win condition just the same. It isn't like other games where by ramping you're getting to play bigger characters and it exponentially increasing the stat that affects your win condition. You're still ramping to bigger characters, but big stats don't win games in Disney Lorcana. I bring this all up to say Grammatala is a great way to further get a payoff for ramping where it's already lacking in the game. Maybe ramping to expensive characters isn't exponentially helping your win condition, but with the help of Grammatala, while you're ramping, it is in a way. I don't think this is enough to make ramping super viable just yet, primarily because it's hard to ramp so much that you're gaining as much lore as you could be with Jafar for instance, by drawing cards, but it's a step in the right direction for sure. I think with the right deck, you can build around this card so that you aren't running out of cards by inking everything in your hand, but still ramping enough to matter. If Sapphire isn't ramping, then they're probably playing items. Sometimes they're doing both with cards like Fishbone Quill, but we got a card in Into the Inklands that helps merge the two themes even more. Tinkerbell, Very Clever Fairy, has the ability I Can Use That, which says whenever one of your items is banished, you may put that card into your inkwell face down and exerted. Sapphire items like Popsicle and Fishbone Quill were already being utilized alongside Hiram Flaversham to draw cards when he banished them. Now you can double down by playing Tinkerbell the turn after Hiram and ramping yourself while drawing cards and playing items. I think with Tinkerbell's 2 lore and this ability, there's a chance she sees play in item heavy decks that want a little extra help with their inkwell. Finally, for the last card in my top 5 Sapphire cards from Into the Inklands, I chose Gyro Gearloose Gadget Wiz, who has the ability Now Try to Keep Up, which lets you exert him to put an item card from your discard on top of your deck. The reason I put him in my top 5 is because currently the only cards that can grab items from your discard are Nick Wilde and Tamatoa. Nick can only grab Popsicle, and Tamatoa is really expensive and a big commitment for item decks just to get an item back from the discard. Gyro is a much cheaper, more reasonable card if you need to be able to bring items back when necessary. Of course, there's the drawback that he puts them on the top of your deck, but paired with other ways to draw cards in Sapphire like Popsicle and Hiram, I don't think it'll be too difficult to dig through your deck even when doing this. Finally, we're moving on to my top 5 cards we're getting in Steel for Into the Inklands, and I have to start with Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood. He may not be as flashy as a bunch of the other cards revealed in this set, but I think this is one of the best cards revealed in the set, period, so it was a no-brainer when making this list. He's an inkable 5 cost with 3 strength, 6 willpower, and 2 lore. He's also a Floodborn, so he can shift for only 3 ink and has 2 abilities, the first of which is Skilled Combatant, which says during your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, gain 2 lore. And the second is the Good of Others, which says when this character is banished in a challenge, you may draw a card. These abilities give Robin Hood the ability to play multiple different roles in a Steel deck. He's a 5 cost card that can shift on 3 and has 2 cheap shift targets in case you're wanting to sing a 5 cost song earlier than turn 5. He's also likely to survive the next turn because of his high willpower. He's also a great board control card because you aren't giving up opportunity costs when challenging with him. Typically, if you're having to challenge and banish your opponent's characters, that means you're delaying your victory because you aren't questing and gaining lore. This isn't the case with Robin Hood when you're banishing characters with him. Not only that, but even if you trade with another character using Robin Hood, you end up ahead in card advantage because you draw a card after both characters are banished in the challenge. At the very least, you're even in card advantage if you shifted him. So you're progressing your win condition, controlling the board, and drawing cards all through one game action. So what happens when your opponent decides not to exert their characters so you can't challenge them with Robin Hood? You just quest with him. His stats are good enough that if your opponent isn't exerting their characters, you can likely just quest. If he gets challenged and banished the next turn, you'll still draw a card off of him. Either way, you're progressing your win condition. The only way to really get around this is by removing Robin Hood through an ability or an action. Because he's able to play all of these roles and gain lots of value if your opponent doesn't have an answer, I think Robin Hood is going to almost always be a solid card to include in any Steel deck. The next card on my top 5 list is And Then Along Came Zeus. The more we learn about locations, the stronger some of them seem to get. Similar to items though, I'm not sure locations will be cards that see play in every deck. Because of this, you don't want to sacrifice card slots in your deck to cards that would only deal damage to or banish locations. Luckily, And Then Along Came Zeus can deal damage to both characters and locations. 5 damage to be exact, which is a lot of damage all things considered. 5 is another magic number and a lot of strong characters' willpower, so this card will be able to take out a bunch of major threats on that front. Locations, on the other hand, can be pretty beefy when it comes to willpower. Sometimes 5 damage won't be enough to banish a location on its own, but it definitely helps if you also need to challenge with other characters. Not to mention, And Then Along Came Zeus is a song, so hopefully you'll be able to utilize characters to sing it since you won't always have to pay for it with your ink. Next in my top 5 cards for Steel is Map of Treasure Planet. Map of Treasure Planet has 2 abilities, the first one letting you exert the item to pay 1 less ink for the next location you play for that turn, and the other passively lets you pay 1 less ink to move your characters to locations. There's quite a few locations that are only 1 cost to move to, and Map of Treasure Planet in play would make it so that every character played could move there for free. Even discounting locations that have a move cost of 2 down to 1 can make a big difference on how much those locations are enabled. Pairing this with cards like the Queen's Castle or Motunui exponentially increases the value you're able to get from those locations, and I think as we get more locations in the game, Map of Treasure Planet gets that much stronger. It's just a card that synergizes synergizes very well with any deck that wants to lean into locations and allows you to use them more efficiently. These final 2 cards from my top 5 list might come as a surprise, primarily because they aren't anything flashy, but I think they're very strong. We'll start with Mr. Smee, Bumbling Mate. He's an inkable 2-cost character with 3 strength, 3 willpower, and 2 lore. That's a crazy stat line for only 2 ink, especially on an inkable card. The drawback is that his ability says if Mr. Smee is exerted and you don't have a captain character in play, Mr. Smee takes 1 damage. All in all, I don't think that's even a terrible drawback. He only takes damage when exerted, and it's only 1, which means if left alone, you could exert Mr. Smee for 3 turns before he was banished. Playing him early is difficult for your opponent to deal with because of his 3 strength, which is likely banishing anything that challenges him so early. If you don't get to play him until later in the game, that isn't an issue either because he has 2 lore, which isn't much different than the lore we see on other more expensive cards meant to be played later anyway. Mr. Smee is just full value town. If you manage to have a captain on board while he's exerted, that's of course great, but I don't even think it matters. 2 lore on a card this strong that can be played at any point in the game and not feel terrible is pretty great for an inkable 2-cost character. The last and certainly not least card that made my top 5 in Steel is Kita, Royal Warrior. At first glance, she's just an inkable 2/3 with 1 lore and bodyguard, but that should look pretty similar to an Amber friend we've seen before. This of course is the exact same stat line on Simba Protective Cub, which is actually pretty huge. Simba has seen first play consistently since the first chapter because of his above average value as a card with bodyguard on top of a typical 2-cost character's worth of stats while still being inkable. Amber was already an ink that excelled with going wide strategies, but you were forced to play this ink if you wanted a cheap bodyguard that was good at protecting your early important characters. Even later in the game, dropping a Simba to disrupt your opponent from being able to challenge your other threats was very valuable. Now that we have essentially the same card in another color, it opens up a lot of possibilities. Not only does it give Steel all of those benefits Amber had with Simba, but it means we can see different deck pairings with similar strategies take form without needing Amber. Or if you really wanted to commit to that type of play, now you can run 8 versions of this card in your Amber Steel deck instead of being limited to 4. Kita is a super simple card that isn't flashy or terribly exciting, but we've already seen with Simba, she's a very valuable, strong, and efficient card. For all of those reasons, I think she's going to see lots of play, and is why she made it into my top 5 for Steel for Into the Inklands. And now we've finally made it through all of the inks. Let me know what you thought of my top 5 cards in every ink for Into the Inklands. Do you agree with any of them or disagree? Are there cards you expected to see and didn't? What cards were missing that you think deserved a place in these spots? I'm eager to hear your opinions down in the comments, and I'm super excited for the cards coming for Into the Inklands. Please don't forget to like this video if you enjoyed it, or dislike if you didn't. Either way, I want your feedback. If you want to see more Disney Lorcana content, be sure to subscribe. I've got lots of fun videos and live streams and events planned for the future I don't think you want to miss. Most importantly, don't forget to take care of yourself. My name is Brandon, also known as B Squared. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.